I was thinking about, just as we prepare for this panel, as we prepare, and I'll invite, while I'm doing this, I want to invite my guests up. Jane Harman, the chair of Freedom House, obviously the former U.S. representative. Please come up, Jane. Mike Greenlee is the CEO of MDA. One of our sponsors today. Mike, great to see you. And Brian Gallant, the CEO of Space Canada, the former premier of New Brunswick. And I was thinking about defense.
Okay.
And being on the Harry S. Truman aircraft carrier during the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And I was on the deck as the jets were taking off for Iraq and Afghanistan with Admiral Gortney, who was the head of the Fifth Fleet. And Gortney said, I said, how long are you going to be here? And he said, we're never going to leave. He said, we never left Germany, we never left Japan, and we're never leaving. And actually, he said, all I need is bullets and bodies on this nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. I could stay out here forever. And for a while, you thought, and then what he did, I said, well, why? And he pulled down a map of the shipping lanes around the world. And he said, we're not here to do anything except protect the shipping lanes. He said, what's going to happen is there's going to be some swift boat somewhere that will sink a ship, and it's carrying supplies that you need to buy at Walmart, and insurance rates will go up, and all of a sudden you get inflation. And we've got to stop that. We've got to patrol the shipping lanes. It was a fascinating moment. The problem is we're not facing the same threats of that time than we are today. Every threat now is asymmetric. We've got internal threats, as Ian pointed out. We've got external threats. And the environment has changed, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's the weapons of mass disruption that Eurasia Group spoke about in our top risks, whether it's China, whether it's Russia. And of course, space, we are in a kind of space race like we haven't seen since the 50s and 60s. And things have changed. This panel is going to dig into the security threats. We're going to specifically focus on space, not only because of the Artemis mission, which space represents our great hope and maybe some of the great perils as well that we face. And this panel is going to dig into that. So it's a great pleasure to have Jane here. And I'll start with you. You've been facing security threats, cross-border threats that the United States and Canada have faced. Sometimes in protecting one, we have hurt the other. And we think back to 9/11 and some of those things that you were involved with. In your view, Jane, what are the critical new security threats and paradigms we're facing today?
So first, let me say how happy I am to be back in Canada. It's not just my great affection for my brilliant and fun friend, Ian, and the Global Zero crowd, but I've been here many times in one of my last gigs as head of the Wilson Center for a decade. And the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, for any one person in the audience who has missed it, is absolutely best in class. And finally, I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Trilateral Commission, so I've been here for that too. So hi, friends. Okay, now I will go out on a limb before answering your question, because that's what Ian wanted, and I'll get in trouble if I don't. Okay. Proposition number one, I bet that everyone in this audience except for Ian is 100% against cannibalism in space. Ian may be softening too, I don't know. Proposition number two, Donald Trump is getting exactly what he wants today. 100 billion viewers. Of course, he'll exaggerate the number of people, plants, and animals on the earth are talking about him. And I think that, if anyone is asking what's going to help Trump win the presidency, that is going to help Trump win the presidency. I might support someone else again and again and again, but nonetheless, I think it's a shame that all of the media is crowding around Donald Trump today. Number three, and this is more relevant to the topic. I've focused a lot, as you said, on intelligence and security over decades and decades. But I would now say that space and technology are the dominant parts of our security architecture, have to be, going forward. And that's why it's so good that people who actually know about this are on this panel. That wouldn't include me. I know about the general idea, and I am on a couple of boards that should help. I'm on the advisory board for NASA, among other things, and I did serve on the space subcommittee in the House decades ago, but they know much more than I do. And then let me make a follow-on point, which is Are we good at this? Answer, in both of our countries. Answer, yes, especially in the private sector. Public sector, not so much. And my claim there is that, unfortunately, politicians are analog, trying to solve digital problems. I've been saying this for years, and my digital skills have not improved. But the younger crowd is better. They're much better because they're digital natives, not digital adapters like me. But actually, they are digital app natives. They know a ton about how to use apps and how to put them on your screens. And my granddaughter keeps saying, "Gee, Ma, why don't you understand this?" But I'm saying they're digital app natives. They really don't understand the technology, like these guys. And if you don't understand the technology and you're in public life or you're assisting someone in public life, it's pretty darn hard to figure out how to regulate it, or at least how to organize the world in terms of some form of guide rails around this technology, which, as we all understand, can be terrific and essential, and which also can kill us if we don't figure out how to get ahead of some of these things. I'm not against them, but I am for thinking seriously about the policy implications. So those are my sort of general rules. As for the US, Chris Coons is going to be here later, and he'll tell you all about Congress. But I would observe a few things from my long time there, and that is, I know, surprise, the business model of the US Congress is broken. What I mean by that is both sides blame each other for not solving problems. That's the business model. Because if you work together, surprise, you are bipartisan, and then you get primaried, and people want to get reelected. So the US Congress, by and large, with some exceptions, Chris Coons certainly being one, is a reelection machine. And it's a very hard place for thoughtful, serious, bipartisan people to flourish and grow. That would be my comment on Congress. However, it does get a few things. One of them is China, at least the worry about China. It's not doing everything right, but it's pretty thoughtful, and the new chair, Mike Gallagher of the House Special Committee on China, is very capable. I'm talking about a Republican. As a Democrat, I'm commending a Republican. But the other thing it's gotten right recently is funding space. And did you know that Congress increased the budget for DOD, that DOD requested for the Space Force, which is a new military command, by almost $2 billion this year, and $7 billion more than was asked for, and plus $7 billion in 2022. So yay, Congress. As for DOD, DOD is embracing the space mission, and with a new Space Force and a focus on R&D. But what is wrong with DOD? The acquisition process. We were just talking about permitting this morning. Try getting anything changed at DOD. Really, really mind-bending. So that's a comment about DOD. I'd finally conclude with NASA. I already confessed that I'm on their advisory council, but NASA is on a roll. It's not just the Artemis program, and great for the 4 astronauts who will all survive, Ian, including the Canadian, who will all survive the mission. But the notion of Artemis and going back to the moon, and first an uncrewed crewed mission now around the moon, and then landing on the moon, things we did decades ago, is wonderful. But there are also 140 countries that have space programs. About 25 or so have already signed the Artemis Accords. And this whole notion of space integrating the world is wonderful. And thank you, NASA, and thank you, the Canadian Space Agency, and thank you, the European Space Agency, and the collaboration that has made this possible. And one other comment, in addition to Artemis being sensational, let's not forget the Webb telescope. And I don't know about the rest of you, that is better than any science fiction movie, and it's not science fiction. When it was announced by a consortium of countries, the comment was made, this is our gift to the world. And if you think about this messy world and all the wars, legal and illegal, that we're fighting around the world, and a security policy to deal with this, and I can talk about that. But if you think about the world, Hard power is never going to be the end game. Using soft power to achieve freedom is the end game. And what is our absolute best soft power at the moment? I would argue it's the Webb telescope and space.
All right, thanks, Jane. Let's talk about that. I'll go to Mike. We're talking, I guess the war in Ukraine highlighted the use of the low Earth orbit satellite and the Elon Musk use, and then all of a sudden low Earth orbit satellite, which was critical, I think the world woke up to space and the new defense posture. In your view, space has been a source of inspiration. I know MDA is doing a lot on that. But it's also now a sector in defense. Can you outline what's going on in space, the kind of geopolitics of space, and how that's playing out on the ground in terms of innovation and the challenges and opportunities there?
Sure. So first I want to see if Jane has available for marketing for the space sector.
Yeah.
Very effective. So we see tremendous growth in space at the moment, tremendous amounts of competition. Like you noted, the conflict in Ukraine has definitely brought to highlight the role of a couple aspects of space, Earth observation in terms of delivering imagery of real activities on the ground every day, and communications that is a very robust form of communication that's expanding rapidly. As a result of those two activities, there's tremendous growth in the space market. So corporations around the world are putting up space-based constellations for Earth observation and space-based networks for communication. That creates a very competitive environment for the entire world. We talk about China a bunch. Space-based capacity for Earth observation and communication is part of Brooks and Rhodes initiatives and the like. Like their ability to reach out and create infrastructure for other nations is also bringing them space capacity. And their industries will be putting up their networks to be able to deliver the same types of services. So we're going to end up with a lot of competition and congestion in low Earth orbit as we go through a period of time. So that's going to bring a commercial dynamic. The other big part of this, though,
how big is the commercial dynamic? Just the space sector is growing. Just give us a sense of how quickly and where it's going.
Well, that's an interesting point, I guess. Right now, it's talked about as about a $400 billion a year market, the space sector. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that in around the 2040 period, it should be about 1.5 trillion a year. So that's pretty significant growth. The interesting thing about that piece of growth, though, is that when you read the literature in China and you look at their assessments of the what they call the Earth to Moon economy in Chinese literature, they would talk about the space economy as a $10 trillion a year market in 2050. So one of the interesting things is we have this expansion and people are investing in it and we're engaging in this capacity, but the other guys, to use that term, are seeing a 10 times advantage, which likely means they're investing 10 times as much. In terms of their, at least enthusiasm, if not their financials. China's viewed as getting to a point where it would have space parity with the United States potentially in public literature by about 2026 and maybe surpass it by 2030. So those of us that are all working together, those 20-odd countries on the Artemis Accords, looking to go to the moon, those 100-odd countries that are all putting up space capacity, we're all working well together at it, but there are more enthusiastic participants going after this large market that we're seeing ahead of us. So that will create a commercial competition, but also defense and security conflict, especially because, as Ukraine has demonstrated, the space interface between governments and industry is a unique interface. When we talk about that land war or that ground conflict, industry will sell military's defense capability and then they will use that in conflict. In space, we get into a much more collaborative domain. We operated our satellites to provide imagery of Ukraine to Ukraine. And so that industry is in play in conflict, providing Earth observation, providing communications. In the future, may provide satellites with robotics capabilities that we use to service satellites. Military may call you up and say, can you go over and service that other satellite? And so the collaboration between industry and governments is very, very intertwined. So the strong competitive aspect of space also requires a very strong government collaboration because commercial conflict may be solved militarily. Some folks from China would think so. And so there's a lot of dynamic activity to still come.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on the cooperation in space, but maybe the competition on the ground that may be impediments from a policy point of view. But let me just go to Brian. Space has always been either an arena of competition or an arena of cooperation, probably both, obviously. In your mind, what are the challenges ahead on that and opportunities specifically in the US-Canada side?
Well, let me start off by saying a big thank you to the organizers for having this discussion. And maybe some of you are wondering why this security, very specifically on space, is a part of this discussion. I'm sure you think it's an interesting topic, but there's so much we could be discussing. So why would this make it onto the roster? In 2022, the World Economic Forum came out with its 5 top risks, which I'm sure most in the room are aware of this annual thing. 2023 was different. A quick side note, it was very focused on affordability, inflation, cost of living crisis, and of course, climate change. But in 2022, just before the illegal invasion of Russia and Ukraine, they came out with their 5 risks, and they had climate change. Well, the World Meteorological Organization says that 50% of the things that we need to be monitoring, the data that we need to be collecting to fight against climate change, will be monitored through space. They talked about geopolitical tensions, and within that they had a few brackets, and one was cyber attacks. And cyber and space are very intertwined and are going to be increasingly, and that will be increasingly the case moving forward. We wrote a paper on it, by the way, so go check it out if you have a minute. They had, of course, as well, inequality. They had some buckets within inequality, and one of the big ones was the digital divide. And if we're going to be addressing the digital divide and helping here in Canada, for example, northern, indigenous, remote, rural communities be able to have the connectivity that they need for the quality of life that they deserve and the economic opportunity that we would like to ensure that they have, it's going to be through space. And then rounding up the top 5, we actually had space traffic, space debris for the first time. So I was just starting my job at Space Canada when this happened, and it made me feel pretty good because obviously those challenges are a bit depressing, but it did make me feel like I'm now a part of a sector that is working incredibly hard on addressing these global challenges. So again, Evan and the team, thank you very much for making space for this. You saw, thank you. Somebody saw what I did there.
Yeah, good.
And of course, you're absolutely right, Evan, that space is an incredible beacon of light for collaboration. Jane spoke about the James Webb Telescope. I mean, that's probably one of the coolest things humanity has done, really, and it was very much a collaborative effort. And then Evan, you did a wonderful job this morning talking about Artemis and you know, that picture of Jeremy Hansen, who's a wonderful person who's going to be a part of this incredible team, and the 3 astronauts from the US telling an incredible story as well. And for us today to be here with US-Canada relations after that historic announcement is awesome. One person put it to me differently yesterday on collaboration and how space can play a role. They said, I won't say who it was because I don't know if they wanted it to be attributed to them, but they said, you know, I've heard this line and it really kind of puts in perspective. They said, this person told me there's only 2 places that the US and Russia speak every day. Okay. And they said, one is the Arctic Council, and you got to push that aside now because Russia's actually the chair, so there's, you know, meetings are a little more complicated now, so that one's actually not happening. And the second is the International Space Station. That's right. So again, it's symbolic for sure, but it, I think, is a demonstration of how when we talk about space, it really can bring humanity together and bring some version of collaboration. So it puts into perspective. Now that said, space is changing. Mike talked about it very eloquently, and the idea is that, the way I like to put it for layman's terms, we launched Space Canada last year, by the way. Anybody launch? No. And when we launched, of course, I was really trying to get immersed in the issues, and to put it in layman's terms, as I was trying to absorb what are the major trends, I put it like this: the accessibility to space is just completely opening up, and because of that, there's a commercialization of space. And if we went really to the other side of the spectrum decades ago, it was very government-led, right? Obviously, any space program would be heavily state invested and sanctioned. So in this case, there's this sort of transition that we're in. I mean, there's tons of space innovators in Canada, in the US, doing incredible things, but it's just different. And our sort of governance of our governments are a bit archaic. In Canada, they're trying to move forward very quickly on sort of revamping, revising regulation, the regulatory framework for space, because they recognize this. So to your question, Evan, it's changing the dynamics immensely. And when it comes to defense and security, space plays a very important role. And we talked about climate change quickly, the greatest challenge facing humanity at the moment, in my humble opinion. And if you look at, for Canada and for North America, the Arctic ice sheets, the thinning of the Arctic ice sheets, the fact that the ice shelves are going to be melting faster are going to make our northern waters more navigable, and that's a thing. That's a thing that we have to start to grapple with, and it's going to be important for Canada's sovereignty and North America's security that we collaborate on ensuring that we're monitoring what's happening, and how are we going to do that? It's going to be through space. So to me, the competition, there's a commercial competition to reap some of the economic benefits that Mike spoke to, but there's also, of course, the idea that there's security, sovereignty, and defense questions that are very significant and important, so there's going to be a race there. And of course, we believe there are all the other things that I mentioned with the World Economic Forum's list of risks. There's immense opportunity to tackle challenges which also come with economic opportunity. So to me, the competition is fierce. There are countries that are, South Korea, for example, never really sort of considered in the top tier. They're investing heavily. They're putting in the governance needed to be as nimble as possible so that they can be able to sort of reap the benefits and obviously use space to be able to tackle the societal, planetary, and economic challenges that they face. I mean, it's going to be a very competitive field because of the changes, the accessibility, and the importance of space and how we can harness its power.
Thanks, Brian. Boy, you put some good ideas in orbit there. Am I paid to do those? I want to go back to Jane. Jane, I want to come back to some of the issues on sovereignty with Mike especially, and how the industry on the ground is functioning within this new atmosphere. But I want to go to Jane. Just Brian pointed out things like the Arctic. We're monitoring a lot of this stuff from space. The Arctic, the kind of geopolitical threats that we're facing now, and as Ian talked about earlier, AI and weapons of mass disruption internally. In your view, when we talk about the kind of macro environment of defense, is North America right now equipped to handle some of these fundamental threats? And if not, as you say, because the policy may be lagging behind the threats, what do we need to do to catch up?
We need to do better, and we can do better. I'm still an optimist about all this stuff. One thing is clear, which is national boundaries are less and less important because the threats we face, think terrorism, think advances in space, think every form of disease and the future, and even income divides don't respect national borders. So where are we headed here? I mean, we have to marshal new resources, new thinking, and new forms of organization to fight this. And I said, and I believe this, that industry is pretty far advanced. I really think so. I think that governments lag behind at every level, and I think it is past time, to renovate the United Nations and other international organizations to do a better job in areas like this, especially climate.
Those organizations are facing unprecedented challenges of relevancy and trust.
I know, so they are. But look, we just proved we have the muscle memory to do this with NATO. That was the Ukraine threat. The EU is doing much better. The US is building some security alliances in Asia, which are pretty darn good. The Quad and AUKUS is not a military alliance, right? Got that. But we've helped our allies in the region build an archipelago of bases. And I'm just saying we have to think beyond the nation state. That is my basic point. And industry does. I mean, most of the folks in this room at least operate in Canada and the US pretty seamlessly, in spite of our different governments, which was a good point made this morning. But they do. And so I'm just saying I'm bullish about industry, and I think we've got to pull up government to be lashed to industry and to invent new forms of organization to deal with this. And if we don't, yeah, we'll suffer because China has a top-down form of government, and you don't have a say. You do what the leader says. The good news, in a kind of ghoulish way, is he's not that talented. Think the quarantine and think his crackdown on tech. which really hurt his economy. So maybe that's good news. Maybe that's bad news because the directions he'll go will be even more dangerous.
I'm going to pick up, Mike, something that Jane said, and the point, well, may be true that we need to cooperate beyond the nation state. And because the problems we're facing, climate and the things that Jane outlined, maybe cross borders. But functionally, when it comes to innovation, borders, like we've been talking about this all day, right? Come to the IRA. When it comes to investment, politicians want to be elected. Jane talked about that in Congress. And you do that by helping your own place. You don't do that by helping the rest of the world. How is that notion of sovereignty playing out against the need for cross-border innovation? And what policies would you say you need, certainly within the US and Canada, to enhance that kind of innovation and try to get beyond those borders that exist?
Yeah, certainly the barriers that were discussed in other discussions today all exist in the space conversation as well, for sure. All of those things are still in play. So we have this situation that is a tremendous opportunity, big economic opportunity, a big geopolitical tension in terms of the race to space. As we go to the moon, that'll be a very strong geopolitical tension. With, as Jane has just spoken, a very focused competitor in terms of China that doesn't have any committees or things to debate. And we say, the U.S.-Canada team and the U.S.-led team, that our greatest advantage is our allies, that is the Artemis Accords, is the 23 nations that are all working together, and we say that that is our greatest advantage. The tricky bit is all of those day-to-day policies and procedures that want to create jobs at home in our own state or our own province, and or our own country, and or our security walls, are all in the way of us realizing our advantage of the allied competitive nature. And so we end up in situations where the entire defense posture in space is top secret and above. So your logical flow in the conversation would be, I mentioned this government-industry collaboration that exists in space. So government and industry need to be cleared, top secret and above, for the companies that are allowed to, across countries, and allowed to collaborate. That sounds like an easy sentence, but it's like incredibly impossible. It's not impossible, but it requires an incredible focus to say that we can hang out together as a team. Let's say the government of Canada and the United States with US and Canadian industry, for those of us cleared to top secret and above, to have conversations about activity in space. All the administrative barriers have to enable that. Similar things in terms of delivering into each other's economies. And so Jane mentioned that most of the companies in the room would set up in Canada and the US, but do we really have to? And so right now we're doing a good job delivering communications technologies into most of the US DoD low Earth orbit communication satellites or missile detection satellites. But there's a competition on the street right now for Earth observation services in the US. Deliver me Earth observation services. And it says, but the satellites, all competitors, the satellites you're going to deliver me the services from has to have been built in the United States. Does it really matter if the Earth observation satellite was built in Montreal or Virginia? If we're delivering a good service from a, let's say an MDA radar, Earth observation radar in Canada, can we not, deliver that well into the United States? But all of our postures get in the way. And even when we have things like the U.S. Defense Production Act, it's not well understood in terms of the opportunity. So a lot of the U.S. defense primes, they'll still be hesitant about pulling forward a Canadian corporation onto their teams. They think they're going to end up in an orange suit or something for doing, for breaking a law, even though the law clearly says, we can collaborate and do these things. So there's a tremendous policy effort that's required to talk about, from a business perspective, a North American space industrial base, and our ability to work together. To do that at a classification level that makes sense, I think going forward, those things are required, to be able to enable all of that to work.
I think that's true, but
Yep.
What's interesting, especially in the defense and related space, is that in the 90s in the US, I was very involved in this as a member of Congress, we declared victory after the Cold War ended. We won, everyone else lost. Ian was talking about this for a moment, and Ian will call this a shot, but I actually wrote a book about this and what we missed, including what he was talking about, but added some other things, Ian. But my point is, we missed this, but we declared victory. We reduced our acquisition budgets for defense and technology. So what happened to the aerospace base, which lived in my district in Los Angeles? they were out of work, triple PhDs out of work. So what was the way forward? The way forward was dual-use technologies, figuring out commercial applications for what basically were defense products so that they could pitch to markets. And that has stuck. And you talk about low Earth orbit observing satellites. They're good for climate, they're good for plastic bottle pollution, and they're good for what's the devastation on the ground in Ukraine. And so, yes, we put up too many classification walls, my view. We overclassify. But there is a workaround, and it is this a commercial technology that we've built up.
And we just have to make that multinational, I think, to allow ourselves to have classification levels, but across countries to be able to enable that collaboration.
Just, Brian, pick up, because this discussion about what are the barriers to cooperation and what do we need to ensure security and sovereignty over North America, which is kind of our theme. What are the key barriers we've got to knock down to sort of follow up in your view, and how fast can we do it? Because I think it's one thing to talk about, it's pretty tricky to do it.
Well, let me start with one that was discussed a little bit with Minister Anand in conversation and others. The whole idea that we have to step up as a country to invest 2% of our GDP for our NATO obligations. And one thing, so I was the Premier of New Brunswick, and 90% of our exports went to the US, 90%, right? So certainly trade is very important. And one thing that we certainly, when I was in office, and we continue to see today, I believe, and it's been discussed throughout today, is the idea that perhaps the US at times takes trade with Canada for granted. Because, as I know all of you know in this room, I would assume we're preaching to the choir, as the expression goes, that so many states have Canada as its primary market. So when you look at defense, I would argue we probably here in Canada take the US for granted. And I worry, and I'm a liberal, by the way, if anybody wants to know, so certainly defense isn't the first thing that necessarily would be at the top of mind of my party, and I, obviously there's changes in personalities, but I think that holds true. And nevertheless, I think we have to step up, because what worries me is President Obama came to Canada, and wonderful visit, was sort of best friends with our Prime Minister. They match on so many things, which is great, and but yet felt the need to say that we needed to step up. And the things that Mike is sort of illustrating, if we want to also, as a country, have the moral high ground to be able to say, and be able to have the moral fortitude to be able to say, we need to open things up here and be able to have Canadian companies supplying you these things, and it's going to be good for all of us. It's going to be good for our economy overall. It's going to be good for our defense security, and in many other ways. We need to step up when sort of asked on this one, in my humble opinion. And when you look at it, President Obama came, asked for that, which is a bit surprising, a Democratic president talking to a liberal government here, liberal prime minister, and then we had the Trump administration. And the Trump administration...
I got a minute and a half, and I got one last rapid fire,
for sure.
So I've got to wrap this one.
And the Trump administration, basically, my humble opinion, was often talking about undermining multilateral organizations. And when it came to NATO, I think that was made a little bit easier because allies weren't stepping up and helping fund. And obviously the argument, I would assume, friends in the room can correct me, but that the argument domestically with Americans to be able to say, well, we're the ones footing the bill for all these things and people aren't stepping up, probably resonates. So Canada needs to step up, and I would argue that Canadians would accept investments in space to develop space capabilities, to help with Earth observation, to help with telecommunications, and that's a way that we can contribute to the defense of North America and with our allies.
Okay, I got a minute here. Just quick rapid fire. Mike, you're in the room with President Biden and Justin Trudeau. You've got two things to tell them about what you need right now, the most important things. What would that be right now? Or you're in the room with a bunch of investors. Most important thing you need from a policy or a perspective.
The policy perspective would be in defense in terms of taking down the barriers that I mentioned, in addition to consider probably things like operational structures where we can operate together in space. We have NORAD for the air. Maybe we should consider a NORAD type thing for space, because sovereignty, as Jane said, these are like, there's no borders here. We need to be able to work together as a team and take down the structures to allow ourselves to participate together.
All right. You got to be careful because you won't make it in politics if you can answer a question that fast. Jane, go ahead.
Improve the sophistication of policymakers in both our governments.
And Brian.
Canada needs a National Space Council. It should be very much what's happening in the U.S. Amanda Lang spoke earlier about importing and exporting policy ideas from the U.S. I think it would be wonderful if we did something similar to be able to make sure we're as holistic, nimble as possible when it comes to space policy and investment here in the country.
Lastly, I want to pick up, I think Jane said earlier that in the US they've put space funding beyond what was asked for. I think Canada should pick up on that too.
Yeah, but we're not going to spend it wisely because we don't have the smartest people in government to make the decisions.
We're going to spend it wisely.
But
We'll set that
fine.
example in
That's fine.
Canada. We'll set
Okay.
that
We
example.
may solve it before we get to the moon. What year are we going to the moon?
We're going to the moon? Well, we're going to
What
go
year
around
do you
the moon
think?
at
What's the
24.
over-under?
The over-under?
To land.
Humans on the moon. 26.
26, that's what I think. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Brian, Jane, and Mike. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Good.
good, Mike.
All right.
As always, yeah, good job.
Yeah.